Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this side event, which is going to send a united call to release all the detained human rights defenders and other prisoners of conscience in Bahrain. This is very important. If you are calling for a reform, then the first step is to release those people who are in prison only for their legitimate and peaceful human rights activities. So that is the focus of this online side event. Let me introduce to you our distinguished speakers. We have with us Nedal Salman. She is the president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and also she is the vice president of the International Federation for Human Rights based in Paris, and also she is IFEX convener. The council of IFEX is led by Nedal. Nedal is in the field. She is working from Bahrain, and she is heavily involved in defending the rights of detained human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience. Also with us, our colleague, Brian Dooley. Brian Dooley is a senior advisor at Human Rights Affairs and also a consultant working with Mary Lawler, the UNHRC Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. He's heavily involved in defending human rights in Bahrain. He went there and he knows most of the defenders and the prisoners of conscience. Now, also with us, Devin Kenney, who is the researcher at Amnesty International. He's also heavily involved in supporting defenders and prisoners of conscience. Amnesty is very important in its work, valuable work on Bahrain. And also with me, my colleague, leading human rights lawyer, Sue William, senior consultant at Deighton Pierce Glynn, a legal firm in London, and also she is the chair of the Human Rights Committee of the Law Society of England and Wales, and also a lecturer at King's College Law School in London. So I welcome you all, our distinguished speakers, and if Nedal is not available, then I will start with Brian. Nedal, are you available? Do you hear me? It seems to me that she's not available, so we will start then with Brian. Brian, as you know, from your own knowledge, we have a chronic problem. It is about our colleagues who are still in prison despite all these lengthy years, including Abdel Hadi Al-Khawaja, Dr. Abdel Jalil Singhes, Naji Patil, and also we have other prisoners of conscience such as Hassan Mshame, Sheikh Ali Salman. So, Brian, what do you think it should be done in order to ensure the release? What else we could do? And if you have any updates about the work of the UNSP, please, Brian, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Khalid. Thank you very much for the organizations, GCHR and the others who are putting this on. I want to say a few things. The first is I'm very heartened that, 11 years after the uprising in Bahrain, there is still interest, including from people, who weren't active in human rights 10 or 11 years ago. I mean, I can see some of you look very young on the screen. And, you've come to this, I suspect, in more recent years. And it's a marvelous testament, frankly, to some of those, including Khalid, but also others in the Bahraini diaspora around the world who've kept this issue alive. I mean, Bahrain is a small country and it's competing all the time for both international media attention and political attention. And I think that a handful of people around the world, not least those who work at GCHR, but also some others at Bird, Mariam Al-Khawaja, Ali Mashema, some others, have done really an extraordinary job in keeping this on the agenda. It's not always top of the agenda, but it's never off of the agenda. And I've never seen, I've been, working in human rights for decades, and I've never seen a small group achieve so much. So it's great that we're still here fighting for the release of people who've been in prison for over a decade. They're not forgotten. And they know that there are people outside every day agitating for their release. Let me say too that having tried to secure the release of some of these people for 11 years, and I know that some of you on this call will also have been working on Bahrain issues for much longer than I have. It's time for a reality check, I guess, and I don't necessarily mean that in a dispiriting or negative way. But if I look back over the last 10 or 11 years and seen the number of human rights defenders, prisoners of conscience who have been released early, and I'd say they've only been released early because of fairly heavy international pressure and attention brought to bear, including by events like this. There have been some successes, and I think we should remember those and how they came about. I mean, in 2011, 2012, there were 47 medics who were arrested after they'd been treating protesters and were seen by the government to be overly sympathetic towards the protesters. Now, nearly all of those were either acquitted or served they served reduced sentences. A couple did have to go to prison, one for 5, one for 2 years. But more or less, they were released, I think, well before they would have been otherwise, had there not been international pressure. There are some other examples then. Political leader Ibrahim Sharif was, I think, released earlier than he would have been because it was politically expedient when the US wanted to resume arms sales to Bahrain. They released him as a token of goodwill. The US lifted its arms embargo, started supplying weapons, and then Bahrain promptly arrested him again. Zainab al-Khawaja was released, I think, earlier than she would have been otherwise because of international pressure. Mariam al-Khawaja was also in jail for a while and was released, I think, without being without being formally put on trial because of international pressure. So it can work, but let's not kid ourselves. It's really bloody expensive in terms of resources. I mean, it is resource intensive. There is no other way of doing it, and we should do it, and we have to do it. But let's not kid ourselves. It's an enormous amount of work. I mean, if you look at the huge international campaign that Lujain's family mounted to have her released, if I can make that comparison, in Saudi, and she was let out of prison. She wasn't released from the country. So that was certainly a partial success, no question, but that was an enormous amount of work. And I think if we're serious about, and we are, about trying to have people released, we need to face the reality. There are no shortcuts here. For every one of those releases, it's a long, tough, tiring struggle. And, some of the other releases we've had have come around earlier than they would have been otherwise, partly through this route of people, prisoners being given or applying for an early release scheme. So Nabil Rajab has managed to get out of prison earlier than he would have done otherwise. And then more recently, Khalil al-Hawachi also. But remember, we've also been trying to secure the release of some others for many years, so far without success. Naji Fatil, Singais, Abdelhadi al-Khawaja, of course. I mean, Ali Mashema has done an enormous amount to raise the case of his dad, very successfully in terms of the amount of media attention it's brought to the case, the amount of media and political pressure also actually it's brought to bear on Bahrain, and yet, his dad's still in prison. Ali Salman hasn't yet been released. I am a little surprised at that, in that I speak mostly here. I mean, I'm here speaking really for Human Rights First, and I'm in America at the moment. I'm in Washington. In fact, the Crown Prince of Bahrain is also in Washington, coincidentally. And under the Obama administration talked a lot, didn't do very much about Bahrain, but when it spoke, it mattered a bit. And back in May 2011. President Obama called for the release of political prisoners, called for the release of peaceful opposition leaders to go into dialogue with the government. He only said it once. He never repeated it. Trump certainly hasn't repeated it, and nor is Biden. And so I think that the US has taken away the focus that it once had in 2011, but I do think it's possible to get that back on there now. You know, the Biden administration talks a very vague, big talk about putting human rights at the center of its foreign policy. I don't see it really as being there. I think it's peripheral at best, but it is an opportunity for us to pin that rhetoric back on the administration and say, you know, if you're going to be saying those things about claiming to be a champion of human rights, then at least you have to go back, at least as a minimum, to where Obama was in 11 years ago. So that's it. I don't want to sound too pessimistic. Excuse me. I'm not pessimistic because I've seen the results that happen when there is a concentrated, enormous amount of international pressure. But that's what it takes. And, you know, I don't think that we should be pretending otherwise. It's a long, hard slog to get people out of prison. But if we're prepared to, you know, week after week, do these events, write the op-eds, do the lobbying, do the hard miles, it can be done. So I'll leave it there. If people want to talk.
Yeah, so
tactics,
anyway.
Traditional media controlled by oppressive governments. And when people went to social media networks, they created the cybercrime laws. And now, as you see yourself, not only the legislations are designed to prison online activism, online activists, and limit online activism. Also, when you have just a proper peaceful activity online, see what the oppressive governments are doing. This is really a visible condemnation for their work. Nobody has interest to hack into a peaceful activity other than our oppressive governments. So we are sure that they are agents for intelligence or for whoever is trying to support the propaganda of oppressive governments, including the government of Bahrain, who failed to release peaceful human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience, despite the fact that they spent years in prison, claiming that they are doing reform. Where is the reform? The first step is to release all the detained defenders. Now, I just want to check if Nedal is in. Nedal, are you in? Nedal, Sue, Devin, any one of you? We have to start with any of you who is available. Nedal, Devin, and Sue.
I'm present,
Devin. Devin, I'm very happy to have you. As you know, the rule of amnesty is significant in defending rights in Bahrain and elsewhere. I leave it with you, Devin, to talk about what else we could do with this, you know, all kinds of attacks we are getting. We are not going to stop, obviously. We will continue our work. But I want to hear from you what else we could do and what is the plan of amnesty to ensure the release of our people who are in prison. We hear you, Devin. Thank you so much.
Well, I think the primary role of international human rights organizations is to publicize cases. I mean, when you say what will amnesty do to ensure their release, ultimately the power actor here is the Bahraini government, and then you hope you can influence them. If they're impervious to influence, you move back a step and see which of their allies you can influence. And then maybe you move back a step further to see how you influence those allies among governments that have committed themselves rhetorically to take what international human rights organizations say. So that typically means pressuring like European Union governments and the British government and the US when there's a halfway tolerable administration in office there. I mean, the amount of publicity that's been given by Amnesty and by many other human rights organizations, including Human Rights First and GCHR, to the political prisoners whose names have been mentioned in Bahrain is immense. And I couldn't possibly say better than Dooley said in about the first 2 minutes of his remarks about how impressive that really is, honestly, in sustaining this level of international attention in this set of cases over the course of more than a decade. I guess what I will just say tactically is, because I tend to like to think about, tactics. How can you appeal to the actors you're addressing to potentially change their behavior? And in terms of who we're addressing, this is the argument I'm about to present is one that could go to the Bahraini government, but one that might also equally apply to the US and the UK, which is that among the set of prisoners of conscience, Ali Salman, who is the Secretary General of Al-Wifaq, I'm not saying his case is more important than all the other prisoners of conscience. It's clearly not, but just in terms of an argument that might be striking to the audience, his case is pretty remarkable in terms of exposing how the Bahraini government operates. So Al-Wifaq was the primary legally registered political opposition in Bahrain in the decade, basically from 2001 to 2010. And they participated in government. They were partners to and interlocutors with the central Bahraini government and the monarchy and those elements in parliament that support it. Obviously, they were very critical. They were the opposition, but they were licensed by the Bahraini government, a part of that government. And that's a tactical choice they themselves made. And they made really serious sacrifices to engage in that political participation and dialogue and debate with the Bahraini government. The opposition in Bahrain is split between those who say you can't speak to this government whatsoever, it's pointless, and another faction that said when there was more of a political opening in that first decade that we should at least try to use the tools that have been made available under the rather limited legislature created in the 2002 Constitution. And Al-Faq was that latter faction. They were the ones who said, let's try to use these tools that are available, even though they're limited. Let's try to play within the rules of the system as it's been set by the government. And they fractured their own movement over that. Haq, which is the leader that I think we can say tends to be most associated with it, is Hassan Mashaima'a, another of the prisoners of conscience. Haq took the more militant position that you can't speak to the government at all, and you can only speak in the language of street protests. And they used to be within Al-Wifaq's coalition, and they bolted. So as the background on Al-Wifaq, since 2011, this individual, Ali Salman, who was basically a voice of moderation and conciliation and efforts to reach compromise and reform within Bahrain, he's literally in prison for life. And his movement, which used to be a participant in government, is banned from existence. Its existence is legally proscribed by the Bahraini government. And anyone hailing from that party, who was a member, is barred from ever running for office. So in terms of the Bahraini government's own interests, in terms of what its allies like to see, in terms of just a government that's not basically courting unrest, I would ask, why on earth is this person in prison? This was, the moderate opposition, and the government Bahrain the message the government of Bahrain is sending is that attempting to compromise with us will lead to you being put in prison for life. So, just in terms of radicalizing the opposition or pushing discourse into much more unhealthy directions, you couldn't choose, a more catastrophic tactic. And neither, presumably the thinking minds, the rational people within the Bahraini government, and certainly its allies in the US and the UK are not looking for the country to slide towards long-term confrontation and more militant stances on both sides. So that is just my general suggestion, which I always raise when possible when meeting with diplomats. Like the other week, we had a meeting with Biden administration State Department people covering Bahrain, and that's a point I tend to thump heavily in these fora. So I'll leave it at that, since I think we've got Nedal with us now.
Thank you a lot, Devin, and we fully appreciate your efforts meeting states that have influence in Bahrain, and in actual fact, the unconditional support given by US and UK to oppressive governments in our region, including the government of Bahrain, probably the main reason why our people still in prison. So we need to work on that to shape positions of these countries in order to make them using their influence in the right direction to support human rights. And now we go to my colleague Nedal Salman, who is going to talk about our colleagues and what need to be done in order to ensure their release. Please, Nedal.
Hello. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to say that we had some technical issues, as you noticed previously. So I'll be very, very brief and quickly. I'll speak about the situation in Bahrain. I will be very optimistic because after 11 years, I think it is the time for Bahrain and Bahrainis to turn this page on 11 years of turmoil in our country. And to turning this page, we encourage again the release of all political prisoners, especially prisoners of conscience and human rights defenders, such as Abdelhadi al-Khawaja and al-Sankis, who lost their freedom because they exercised their international guaranteed human rights. We also call for the government to expand and impartially implement the alternative penalty law to include every prisoner who is eligible for conditional release. Releasing all these political prisoners may pave the way for national dialogue and reconciliation, which we all Bahrainis long for. We as well call the government to ease the restriction on civil society and make room for different voices, because we need each other and we need to hear different voices to be a better Bahrain, as the world now knows that suppression does not achieve stability. It is also time for the government to take tangible steps in addressing the human rights situation through constant human rights reform, deal with the grievances of all victims, and ally the legislation with international human rights standards. We love Bahrain and we want the best for our country. So it is time to think of the future and have a better Bahrain. And that is fair enough, because as I see that after what happened with this technical issue, I'll be very brief in my message. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, my colleague Nedal, and I fully appreciate your work. I know you are working in a very hostile environment, and the fact that they try to hack into our meeting will make it very difficult for you to talk. So I know you are a courageous human rights defender, and I fully appreciate your work and the work of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. I have to mention my colleague Abdelhadi al-Khawaja, who said human rights work never ends in a prison, and he proved that through more than 5 hunger strikes in which he demanded his rights as a prisoner of conscience and the rights of others. And I have to mention Dr. Abdul Jalil Singez. He just by today entered the day 239 days of hunger strike, demanding to get his research back. There are some papers that he put a lot of time, many years, he completed his research, but they confiscated all the papers. He just wants his research to be back given to him or to his family. And we know now that he's facing really a deteriorated health issues. With that, I stop and I call on our colleague, leading human rights lawyer, Sue Willman, to talk about her view, how we could ensure the release of our colleagues in Bahrain. And also, she will mention an event focused on Bahrain that we are going to hold by the end of this month. Yes, Sue, please.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you, Nedal. I am always inspired when I meet human rights defenders from Bahrain, and especially those who are still inside the country. It's really important that everyone is here today to bear witness to that and not to forget about the people that are still in prison, who've been mistreated but have still maintained their struggle for human rights and democracy. And perhaps I should be talking about surveillance and how we can tackle that in the light of what happened earlier. But instead, I'm going to try to talk a bit about how we might tackle, how the international community could provide some support through the sanctions regime. It was 10 years ago, I realized, when I first became aware of prisoners in Bahrain in the spring of 2012, when I heard the stories of two religious and opposition leaders who were in jail, who are still in jail. They're called Sheikh al-Muqdad and Sheikh al-Mahrouz. And I read their stories of torture, and I also spoke to one of them through an interpreter. And I was told that the information about their torture had been presented to the criminal court, and yet they were still convicted and sentenced. And they both alleged that they had been directly tortured by Prince Nasser al-Khalifa, who is the son of the King of Bahrain. I've started off by mentioning the fact that their torture was referred to at the trial, yet the cases went ahead, as a contrast with the international prohibition on torture evidence in criminal cases. So here at King's Law School, I was recently involved in an amicus or legal intervention in an appeal in Washington, DC appeal court, because US lawyers had been arguing that torture evidence in the case of a man who had been held or is held at Guantanamo called al-Nashri could be admitted in procedural hearings. I'm pleased to say that an outcome of that case was that the Biden administration has changed its policy and has confirmed that torture evidence should never be used even in procedural hearings before military tribunals. So the US is clear about that, and if torture evidence is used, the trial is automatically unfair, yet al-Muqdad and al-Mahrouz and others who have been tortured prior to their conviction in Bahrain remain in prison. And 10 years later, there is no date for their release of the opposition leaders who were scooped up after the Arab Spring protests of 2011. I'd like to be able to say that based on evidence I've seen, that torture in Bahrain, mistreatment in prisons is a thing of the past, linked to a knee-jerk reaction to the Arab Spring peaceful protests, and that following those protests, when the Bahrain government commissioned the BCHR report, that they thought better of it and that they changed their processes. But unfortunately, the reverse is true. So as Khalid mentioned, my law firm Deighton Pierce Glynn is currently finalising a report commissioned by the Gulf Center for Human Rights, which gives graphic descriptions of torture. Some of the people who experienced that mistreatment experienced it back in 2011, 2012, but some experienced it much more recently in 2017. GCHR produced a report last year on patterns of torture in Bahrain, and what's striking is that the same Minister of the Interior who presided over past mistreatment of people in prison remains in place, and there's clearly a systemic pattern of mistreatment of men, women and children in Bahrain's jails. The NGO Bird have documented this more recently, especially focusing on the treatment of young people in police stations as well as jails. So government and ministers of Bahrain are not only aware of this and have failed to act, but they're complicit in it, and they must be held accountable. GCHR's report is going to discuss how they could be held accountable, whether using criminal powers under universal jurisdiction or the Magnitsky sanctions regime. And it seemed a very appropriate time to be talking about Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian lawyer who was beaten to death in a Russian jail for exposing multi-million corruption linked to the Kremlin. And his death led to the Magnitsky Act in the US, called the Global Magnitsky Act, to tackle egregious human rights abuses. Other states followed suit, like Canada, the UK, and more recently in 2020, the EU. And I've noticed that ECDHR are here. They launched a campaign to apply the EU global human rights sanction regime to Bahrain. What these regimes do is that where there are gross human rights violations, such as crimes against humanity and torture, forced disappearances, which are in breach of international law norms, and where they're widespread and systemic, that sanctions can be applied against those who are responsible for them, the perpetrators. So the UK's first wave of sanctions under the regime included 20 Saudi nationals involved in the death of Jamal Khashoggi, as well as various Russians and some high-ranking military generals from Myanmar. I think it's important that international events in Europe where sanctions may be discussed don't take attention away from what's happening in the Gulf, from the war in Yemen, from the extreme human rights abuses that we've heard about, and the mistreatment of prisoners. So we anticipate that we'll be shortly making a formal request to the UK's Foreign Minister, Dominic Raab, to make use of the sanctions regime against those responsible in the name of NGOs based in the UK or working in Europe, such as Bird and GCHR. It's really important to have events like this to keep the plight of prisoners like Al-Maqdad, like Al-Khawaja, like Al-Mahrouz and others in the spotlight. So as Khalid said, we're hoping to launch the GCHR report and the call for sanctions as a parliamentary event in March in London, and we'd really like your support. The support of other NGOs and international NGOs to call for Magnitsky sanctions against the Minister of the Interior and others responsible for the continuing detention and mistreatment of prisoners in Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Sue, and thank you for mentioning our other project, which is focused on accountability and ending the culture of impunity in Bahrain. So while we are calling for the release of our detained colleagues, we are really continuing our work on accountability in Bahrain and elsewhere. Now we have a few minutes for questions. If you have any question for any one of our distinguished speakers, you are more than welcome. Yes. So we want to see if there is any question. Is there any raised hand? You could just talk directly if you have a question. While we are waiting for questions, I just want to send from here on behalf of my colleagues, the distinguished speakers, and myself and the organizers of this event, ADHRB, BCHR, GCHR, Human Rights Affairs, and Deighton Pierce Glynn a united call on the government of Bahrain to release all the detained human rights defenders. Enough is enough. Release them and prove your belief in human rights. This is the first step in any reliable reform. So that is our united call. On behalf of this activity, we will continue whatever you are going to do, hacking or without hacking or whatever other tools you are going to use. Pegasus and other projects that are designed to hack into our accounts. We will continue until we see full respect to the civil and human rights of every single citizen in our countries. So that is our call. I think if there is no any question, I will give our speakers the final say. I go back to Brian for 1 minute to say whatever he has to say. Brian, please.
Thanks very much, Khalid. I suppose, I'd like to say something pretty specific to finish with. A big part, of course, of the pressure that can be brought is by the US government. The Biden administration has been very disappointing so far in its action and even in its words. And, we found before that the way to get an administration to act is to get the US Congress to push the administration to act. So I think it's time for us to go back, start again. We're not exactly starting at the bottom of the hill. There already is some energy and some sympathy around human rights in Bahrain for Congress, but I'm afraid some of us thought that the Biden administration would try to do the right thing without being pushed. It looks like it's going to have to be pushed, and the people that can push it are our friends on this in the US Congress. So we're going to have to go back to them and get them to push the Biden administration to do the basic things it ought to be doing anyway. But we can and we will do that.
Thank you a lot, Brian. And we go to Devin for his final say in 1 minute. Yes, Devin.
Thanks, Khalid. Well, I had some prepared remarks, which we didn't have time to get through, but I'll just try and condense the final points of those, I guess, or the central points. One is that if you go through the report of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, there's pretty strong evidence in it that all of the 10 political leaders from 2011 who are still in prison were victims of torture. Two is that when we say that we classify them as prisoners of conscience, that's at least as Amnesty uses it, that term means that they were imprisoned not for any act of violence, but for nothing further than the exercise of one of their human rights, one of their natural rights, typically the rights of association, speech, or assembly, which is the case here. So basically, we're talking about a set of prisoners who are victims of torture, who have been held who've lost over a decade of their lives for doing nothing more than trying to non-violently criticize the government. And we're over a decade past 2011, but the fact that they're still in prison shows that Bahrain is still locked in a state of repression, that it began in 2011, and we shouldn't have illusions otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Devin. Nedal, are you still with us? Do you want to say something, or maybe let me see if she is available, Nedal. I think she left due to the hacking. Now we go back to Sue. If you have anything else to add.
Yes, someone's asking about redirecting the attention of the EU. I think it's not about redirecting. I think it's about understanding that struggles about human rights are universal, and if we can join together with other human rights struggles where we see the same issues, then we can become stronger. I'd like to go back to the words of one of the men who is in prison, Al-Khawaja. His daughters told me that when they felt downhearted by how long the struggle had carried on for, he told them that the struggle for human rights and democracy was not a struggle that could be won in a lifetime. So I think we need to be prepared for a long battle, and along the way there are smaller victories. As Brian referred to, lots of people have been released, and we need to keep battling for our brothers and sisters who are in Bahrain to be released from prison. We need to keep fighting for human rights in Bahrain wherever we can in the West, and drawing attention to it through the media and through events, and trying to show support to the organizations that are still doing this really vital work. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Sue. That is a very wonderful ending to this event. We have to keep fighting for human rights. So a lot of thanks to the organizers, Human Rights Affairs, Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain, Bahrain Center for Human Rights, Gulf Center for Human Rights, and Deighton Pierce Glynn. Also, a lot of thanks to our distinguished speakers, Nedal Salmani, Brian Dooley, Devin Kenney, and Sue Willman. Also, a lot of thanks to you who attended the event. Thank you a lot for joining us despite all the difficulties. Thank you all, and I wish you a very nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.